guess you could say the journey was long because I started writing poems when I was about in the second grade. I didn't show them to anyone. I've told people before, they ended up in a shopping bag. They ended up in a shopping bag, and most of them should have been in the shopping bag. They didn't need to see the light of day. But they were good practice. It was really good practice for writing. And I did that all through high school, through college. I kept writing, but showing people very, very little of it. And then I decided when my boys were born, I started reading picture books to them. And that was really my first exposure to picture books. And I fell in love. I absolutely fell in love with them. When they were infants still in my arms, I was reading to them. And the more I read to them, the more I decided, this is it. This is what I want my writing to focus on.
Oh, wonderful. And when you were younger, you never really imagined that you'd be a picture book author. Did you imagine that maybe you were going more into poetry? I mean, had you imagined yourself as a writer, but maybe not this genre?
No. I didn't know it was a job. I didn't know it was something that people
just for fun.
Did. No, it could make money off of. I didn't even know picture books were a real thing when I was little. We had a few in our house, but we didn't have money to buy a lot. And the library was my father. We had one car that my father brought to work, and there was no bus in our town. So there was no avenue for me to get a lot of picture books. And when I started reading, when my mother had gone to work and there was a little extra money, by that time I was about in the second or third grade, and I started reading chapter books. So I just kind of skipped over picture books, and that's why I didn't know it was a thing to write them, because I didn't know they were a thing.
Well, and so you did end up starting with the picture books as an author, and now you've branched out into doing chapter books. You just launched a chapter book series, the Rica Baptista series. And sorry, I'm not sure for those watching, but you're breaking up a little bit for me. But so you tell us, what made you decide to branch out into doing chapter books? And then can you tell us some about this new series?
Okay. In terms of writing a chapter book, I started out with this story, which literally just the first line popped into my head. I wasn't intending on writing anything at that moment. I was actually on vacation. My husband had taken our boys on an early morning fishing trip, and I was going to the beach by myself and looking forward to an early morning quiet beach outing. And this fully formed line came into my head, and I looked up and I looked around and went, where did that come from? Because I had no idea. And by the time I got to the beach, I realized I had a notebook in the car that I brought with me, and just started writing out the story. And at that point, I was writing a picture book because that's what I wrote. That's what I was used to. And then I realized that it didn't have the visuals for a picture book story. So I tried it as a magazine story, kind of went back and forth with Highlights magazine for a little bit, but I couldn't quite wrap my head around what the changes that they wanted, and they couldn't quite wrap their head around the way I wanted it. So we kind of both said, well, thanks, but I think maybe it belongs elsewhere. And I went to a Whispering Pines writers retreat. Whispering Pines is a wonderful writers retreat here in New England. And during a peer critique, somebody said, that's a middle grade novel. So I started writing a middle grade novel instead. It was complete. I finished the middle grade novel. And with that middle grade novel, I got an agent. And she tried really hard to sell it. She tried really hard. And the feedback was amazing. The feedback was wonderful. I heard, great characters, great setting, great voice. I even heard from a Big 5 publisher, best middle grade voice I ever heard. And they all
Wow.
said, each and every one said no. This isn't going to work, because they all said the plot just wasn't there. It wasn't strong enough for a middle grade novel. But my agent still kept trying and trying, and finally we decided, maybe this isn't working. I had gone to another Whispering Pines retreat, and Christian Trimmer did a manuscript critique of the middle grade novel. And he looked at it and he said, "You've got great characters, you've got great voice, and your plot is terrible." He might not have used the word terrible, but it was pretty clear what he meant. He said, "However, you have a great setup for a chapter book series." I thought, that sounds interesting. And my agent really didn't want to try it as a chapter book series. He tried it a little while longer as a middle grade. And finally, we just decided maybe this needs to go in another direction, and, a friendly parting of the ways. And then I started playing around with it as a chapter book series. So that's how it happened. And if anyone out there knows how to get in touch with Christian Trimmer, I think he's now with Disney. I could be wrong. I am wrong. Anyway, if anybody knows him, please tell him I said thank you, because I have no way to get in touch with him. But the series is about Rica and her family and her best friend, Lainey. Rica's kind of an introvert. She says things in her head that she usually doesn't say out loud. There's a lot that goes on inside her head. But even though she tends to be quieter, she's also very resilient, very willing to give things another try. And she's also kind of funny, as most of the characters in this story are.
Right. And what wonderful feedback that you got, and also that you were so flexible to adapt to so willing to take it and try doing a different direction with the book. And like you said, you got this, the feedback about her voice, and that's one thing I've read is just what a great character she is, and really determined and resourceful. What inspired that character, Rica's character?
The story came first, way back when the lines first came into my head, and the original story has nothing in common with, except for the characters. Is
the first line still in the book?
Nope.
Oh.
It's not even in the story. It's not even about what that story was. I ended up taking the characters out and plopping them into the middle grade, and into the chapter book series. At some point, I do see the possibility of weaving in that original storyline. It does mean a fight between Rica and her best friend Lainey, which actually could get kind of deep for a chapter book. So I really want to set up the relationship between the two of them as being very strong before I delve into, that piece that was in the middle grade novel. But so that part is not in it at all. So the story is a lot different. Rica finds out that her best friend Lainey is moving away to another state, and she's devastated. She's not good at making friends because she's quieter, and she didn't have to make friends before. She had Lainey, but now Lainey was leaving, so she thought, well, maybe if I get a family. But she's looking for an extraordinary pet to replace an extraordinary friend. So she doesn't care if it's a llama, an iguana, pot-bellied pig. What else? What else does she look at? A kinkajou, a quokka. I had never even heard of a quokka before I started writing it. In fact, the whole thing had been revised, was into my editor, and we were just doing final tweaks when I happened to hear about a quokka. And I Googled, you have to Google a picture of a quokka. You just have to. And when I saw this picture, I emailed my editor and said, Andrea, the quokka has to go in there. Can I put this paragraph in about the quokka?
Oh.
And she said yes. But, so she wants an extraordinary pet. Most of what she comes up with should not be pets, but luckily she has a know-it-all and very quick at Googling older cousin who will say, nope, nope, that's illegal to own that, or, they're herd animals. You'd have to get a lot of them. A very, very annoying cousin who she also loves very, very much. So that's the setup for the first story.
And have you started thinking, I mean, I know this is going to be a series, so have you started working on the later books or thinking, or do you think, are you also going to be doing more picture books, kind of now that you've tried out the chapter book series?
Well, there will definitely be 3 books in the series. Cross your fingers for more. Candlewick, you're listening, crossing my fingers. But there will be 3 books in the series. The second one has been written, it's been revised, editorial revisions made, and it's the art that I think that's in the works now. It's due to come out early 2024. Okay. I'm hoping it still comes out in 23, but so far it's on board for 2024. And then the third one I have written and am now revising before I send it off to my editor. I'm also working on some picture book manuscripts, a few new ones, revising a few old ones. And so we'll see what happens with those.
It's always so funny, I think, for those of us who aren't in the publishing world to realize how long it is from when you write it to when we actually see it on bookshelves.
It's excruciatingly slow, really slow. You learn patience. You definitely.
Right. Well, to go back, so I know it's not so much in the first Rica Baptista book, although I've heard you say that it probably will come up in the next one, that you always you focus a lot on family relationships. And I think I've heard you say that will probably come up with maybe a grandfather visit in a later book of Rica Baptista. But of course, Time for Bed, Old House has this wonderful relationship of grandfather and grandchild. And Seaside Dream also focuses on the grandparent relationship. Why is that? What is so special about that relationship that you've tended to focus on that a lot?
I found that I just can't stop writing about grandparents. And it's probably because my relationship with my own grandparents was very, very strong. My mother's parents lived just 15 minutes away from us, and my father's parents were right next door. So when my mother went to work, I spent my days as a 5-year-old with my grandmother and my grandfather, but mostly with my grandmother. And she told me lots of stories. And that's what inspired the first picture book, Seaside Dream. The stories I remember her telling me of how much she missed the Cape Verde Islands, about, her sister. And when I did some research, I found the ship's record from when she came over, and it was her sister that actually brought her, to the ship to come over here. And so that's where that came from. And I'm really glad that my first story was about my grandmother, because she was such an important part of my life. All 4 of my grandparents were, but I couldn't see not, writing about grandparents, I guess. And the second story, Time for Bed, Old House, actually started as a story. It was inspired by putting my own children to sleep, or rather putting my oldest son to sleep. My second son never slept, so it didn't work. But trying to go through the routine of, settling the house to get them ready for bed, that's where the inspiration came from. And it started out as a mother-child book, but it became a much stronger story when I made it a grandparent and child book. I think because I was able to take myself out of it and put someone else in place. And then the first Rica Baptista story, The Llamas, Iguanas, and My Very Best Friend, the one that's out now, doesn't have a grandparent in it. And I thought, oh, I am able to write things without grandparents in them. The second one, which is, I told you, has been completely written. Grampy comes to visit. And as Rica says, the best Grampy of all Grampies is there for their adventure week, except he shows up with a sprained ankle, and their adventure week becomes a stay venture week.
Oh, I love
And
it.
then chaos ensues.
Well, and speaking of grandparents, I mean, I understand that is it her great-great-grandfather, Rica's, had immigrated from Cape Verde, and I know your grandparents had. Why was that important to you to incorporate that into the stories?
I think especially with the chapter book series, you're seeing so much of their lives that it had to be a part of it. My writing is everyone's, just comes from within. So to have her, have her background showing that, to me, meant that her background needed to be Cape Verdean American. If it's a shorter snippet in time, it's not necessary. Seaside Dream is a picture book, but again, inspired by my grandmother, so it made sense that my Cape Verdean heritage would show through. However, Time for Build House, we don't know if they're Cape Verdean or not. They might be, but they don't have to be. I did ask that the characters would be depicted as characters of color. That was important to me because the story, they could be anybody. They could be absolutely anybody. But I felt it was important to have some stories out there which are just, happy families, celebrating, each other, and have people of color, to have Black people, depicted as just a warm, loving family, and no drama going on. So, and Candlewick, immediately agreed to that. They said yes. But maybe they're Cape Verdean, maybe they're not. We don't really know. But it's just a short snippet of time. So because it's a short snippet of time, we don't really have to go into their background very much. With the chapter book series, you learn much more about family, etc. So it really did need to be a part of the chapter book series.
Right. And was that, I don't know, that must have been kind of fun for you, because I know writing picture books, you have to keep the text so short. But was that nice to kind of have room to expand a little more, to see more sides of the characters than you would have if it had been a picture book?
Oh, we get to see much more. If it had stayed, if that first story, which again is not what the first book ended up being, but if the first story were a picture book, we wouldn't know her mother and father, who are prominent in the story. We would have known her cousin Serenity, who initially had a very, very small part, but Serenity is a little bit demanding, and she demanded a bigger part. She just kept showing up.
That.
Every time I wrote, the door opened and she walked in. And she is the only character that is very much based on one person. All my other characters and all of my stories they're all fictional, and she's fictional too. But most are mostly imagination, sometimes with tiny bits of real people woven in. However, Serenity was very much based on my older cousin who lived down the street, who loved to tell me what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And sometimes she was right. Sometimes she was right. But I always found it very annoying. However, I loved her completely. She loved me completely. And that's where Serenity came from. So my cousin Cynthia Conward, who is since passed, I miss her, still love her, still feel her in my life, but Cynthia Conward became Serenity Conway in the book. And it's the only character who's based on someone real.
Oh, that's so beautiful. What a great way to honor her memory.
It's honoring her memory, and I get the last word, which I didn't get before, but now I do.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was so fun to talk to you. I mean, this is one of our favorite books in our house, and I can't wait to read the new chapter book. So thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I enjoyed it.